This is the business part, because everybody knows this is one that I found that hadn't been fired yet, right? So this was in somebody's pouch. He hadn't put it in and fired it, because when you fire it, you end up just with your cartridge, right? Because the business end is what goes forward, okay? And that's the part that will hurt somebody. And so this one hadn't been fired. Actually, I stuck it back in there, because you're not allowed to bring back stuff that has powder in it. They kind of frown upon that. Goes through the machine, you know, at the airport, and it kind of like lights up everything, and then you have to explain why you've got these things. So what I do is I find these things, and I take them to the restroom and wash them out, get all the powder out of them if they're full, whatever, and bring them home. Okay, you can do that legally. Bugles were loaded. Bugles were used to start an attack. You jump up out of the trenches. The officers were generally jump up first. The life expectancy of a second lieutenant or a captain in the First World War was about 3 weeks. Okay, so many enlisted men were older enlisted men, not just younger, but older, because they didn't want to take a leadership role. Why should I? Because the first thing they do is jump up, blow the bugle, or blow their whistle. You've seen that in some of the movies too, where they blow a whistle and then everybody would go over the top, right, in the attack. Or they blow a bugle. Well, the minute they did that, of course, the other side would start swinging that machine gun fire. Okay, and also we had a nice little thing, I didn't cover this before, but a nice little invention called barbed wire that was rolled out there in no man's land at night. Rolled out in such quantities, okay, that there were bales and bales and bales of this. There still are bales just outside of Eaton, okay, that haven't been used. They still have them piled up from the First World War, but they haven't unwound, okay? And of course, to start an attack, you had to go out in front at night, because you were going to attack through certain areas, and cut the wire. Fun job. Any volunteers? Anybody want to go out there and cut the wire tonight? Because every now and then, just for fun, the enemy would sweep, just to make sure everything was clean out there, back and forth. And if you were out there, not good. But you had people going out there cutting the wire, because the next day you were going to attack through those gaps in the wire. Or you would try to use your artillery to blow gaps in the wire. And that again worked sometimes, but didn't work other times. People would get hung up on the wire. Okay? They couldn't get any farther. They would be tangled in the wire. Or in Passchendaele, the land was so churned up and the water table was so low, and the rain was the worst in more than 100 years of record. And they actually think that there was so much artillery that, as cloudy as it is, most of you have been to Belgium, and usually it's cloudy and rainy, okay? But as cloudy as it is there, it oftentimes doesn't rain. But with this tremendous artillery bombardment, suddenly, it's like seeding the clouds. You know, you've heard about explosions that would cause rain. And that it rained heavier from 1915 to 1918 than any other years in recorded history in Belgium. I don't think that's an accident. And so it became so wet and so muddy, they would have to put what they call duck boards out for the attack. So you could only attack on these boards, okay? If you fell off the board, you went into mud that was like quicksand, and you actually went down. It was that bad. And soldiers, during the attack, were not allowed to stop and pull somebody out, even if it was their closest friend. And oftentimes, when the attacks were beaten back, they would come back, and they would see the bayonets or parts of a hand sticking out of the mud. People had been suffocated. It was that horrendous. Passchendaele was noted for that. Passchendaele is a small village just outside of Eat, Belgium. And at Eat, Belgium, every night at 8 o'clock, every single night, 365 days a year. And if you ever go to Belgium, go to it. It's the most moving ceremony. They'll have the last post. And they'll play the bugles. They have a team of buglers. And in front there, they'll say this: They shall not grow old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. And then you'll hear the crowd, we will remember them. Every night. There's 77,000 names on the Menden Gate of soldiers who died in World War I, whose bodies were never identified or found. And if you go to many of the cemeteries, the majority of the soldiers in there are unknown, known but God. Rudyard Kipling, most of you have heard of him. His son, John, was was medically not fit for service because he was legally blind. He had big Coke bottle type glasses. He struggled to become a soldier, struggled to become an officer. He was denied and denied and denied, and finally through his father, he was allowed to become a lieutenant. He lasted 1 week on the Somme. And Rudyard Kipling's wife never spoke to Rudyard Kipling after that, ever. They lived in the same house, they never spoke. So the war was a horrible war. And the sacrifices the French made were incredible. And the Americans helped the French. It's that, I think, relationship that has existed since the time of Washington, Rochambeau, and all the Americans and French together, and one that's continuing even today. I just want to conclude then by saying, I think one of the most beautiful pieces of poetry that came out of the First World War, of course, is one that most of you probably have heard, but I'll conclude with it. And it's called In Flanders Field by John McCrae. He was a Canadian medical doctor. His medical aid station is just outside of Ypres, Belgium. It's still there, next to a cemetery. It's a unique cemetery, though, in that usually the crosses are neatly lined in rows. In fact, he even say in his poem that they're in rows. But there was so much bombardment around that cemetery, around his aid station, that many of the bodies that are there, and those are the people that are buried in that cemetery, are those that succumbed to the wounds that he couldn't save. Many of the bodies that are buried there had to be buried 2 or 3 times because of the bombardment. And so they're going to see regular ways that they were buried. In that cemetery also is one soldier, Strudwick. He had went forward the night before on a night patrol, been decorated for it, and sent back to the rear as a bonus, a 3-day pass, because he had done so well. He brought back 3 German prisoners in that night patrol. He found some Germans out there snooping around in no man's land too. Brought them back with him. Say, hey, Strudwick, you did pretty good. You got a 3-day pass, go to the rear. He was killed by artillery fire about a mile from the front. He was 14 years old. So here's In Flanders Field, and then that'll be the conclusion. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw a sunset glow. Loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Field. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hinds we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. John McCrae wrote this poem for his best friend, Alex Helmer. Alex Helmer was an artilleryman. John McCrae had been an artilleryman in the Boer War, had went back to Canada and become a doctor of medicine. He would often go and actually help Alex tend the guns when he was off from his medical duties. Well, Alex Helmer was killed in an artillery barrage. In fact, his body was never found or identified, just pieces of him. And John McCrae sat down and wrote this poem in honor of him and sent it to Punch magazine. It was published, probably the most famous World War I poem there is. So tonight, again, leave this session, I guess, with a feeling of appreciation and commemoration
to all those French soldiers. And again, the statistics are sobering. The total statistics are more than 6 million French died and were wounded in World War I. 6 million. Okay? It is an incredible statistic. 1,357,000 of those, that total, were killed in action. 75% of all French combatants were killed or wounded in World War I. It is a mind-sobering statistic. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. I'll take a few questions for those that have questions. Yes, sir.
There's a famous phrase about British officers being about lying, being led by donkeys, and referring to incompetence. And I just wondered your view, because you made a comment earlier about people not appreciating the way technology has changed war. Were they mostly incompetent, or were they just not aware?
In some cases, they were very. The question had to do with whether, he's talking specifically about British officers, but I think you could translate it to just about any officers. Were the high-level officers very, very incompetent, okay, during this time period, sending soldiers forward and things like that? I would have to say yes to many extent, whether it was Haig or Bosch or any of those. And the reason I say that is most often the highest ranking soldiers never visited the front, okay? And that is pretty pathetic, considering the masses and millions of men that they're sending forward. They never visited the front. They would send a staff officer. There's a famous little anecdote from Haig's British general. He sent his chief of staff to the front one day, and he came back and he said, "Well, what's it like up there?" He never, Haig's asking, "What's it like up there?" He said, "You can't believe it. It's horrible. You can't believe it." "What do you mean it's horrible?" I can't explain it. And he couldn't. And he just started stuttering, and he couldn't spit it out. And he was actually relieved, okay, from his position. And so they didn't, I think, see the battlefield. And you see some of that in the movie What Price Glory, where you see the higher ranking officers, this is noble and everything else. They don't understand what it's like to be a soldier, I think, under these conditions. And when they have these great and grandiose plans to attack, without any real chance of success, they were also oftentimes told, whatever you do, do not run toward the enemy. Walk firmly. Okay, wait a second. Okay, walk firmly. What does that mean? Stay in line. Walk firmly. Walk with a purpose, but don't, run ahead and get down and run ahead and get down. There wasn't this idea of fire maneuver that we have in today's army, where you're going to go up and fire and then plop yourself down on the ground, okay, and take cover and let somebody else come up. That was developed later on in the war, but in the early part of the war, in the first 3 years, you were supposed to get up from the trench in line and move forward. And you've probably seen that famous World War I picture where the guys are getting up out of the trench, and you can actually see them getting up and then falling one at a time until there's only one guy left. You've seen that all. And so it didn't work. And so I don't think there was a good net. Yes, sir?
Yes, I'd just like to correct you saying that most of the German leaders who signed, the politicians who signed the peace treaty were Jewish.
I didn't say most, I said some.
Some. It's really only Walter Rathenau that we know of.
Right.
Matthias Erzberger, who led the Catholic Center Party and who defended blacks, who had investigated the massacre of blacks early in 1907, was Catholic. And both he and Rathenau were murdered about a year and a half.
Yeah, they're killed by the Nazis. But they weren't Nazis at the time. They were.
Actually, Admiral Canaris headed several hit teams that murdered, and then later he was executed by Hitler himself.
Right. Hey. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. In 1995, I was part of the planning for UN 50 in San Francisco.
Pardon me?
In 1995, I was part of the planning of UN 50 in
Yes.
San Francisco. And the head of it was Ambassador Richard Butler. and he wanted to go to Stanford, where I work, to meet with the international, department. And because they're looking at changing the charter, we went and including and expanding the Security Council. And one of the members asked him, would, in the Security Council, if it was expanded, would they include Japan or Germany? And he said not in his lifetime. And about 4 years ago, I asked the then French ambassador here that same question, and he said he agreed. Do you have a sense of that?
Well, as far as the animosity that still exists,
Yes. Because I was shocked, when...
yeah, I'm not shocked. I think the animosity now from the First World War is obviously because most of the well, not most, but all the participants are dead now. But I think from the Second World War and the occupation, obviously there's still a lot of animosity between the French and British. But I will say that for the first time in a long time, I think it was about 5 years ago or so, in Normandy, the German representatives were invited to the, not the celebration, but to the remembrance ceremonies in Normandy. Likewise, the German cemeteries in France were not allowed to be mowed, okay? And would oftentimes grow, by French. In other words, people had to come from Germany, volunteers from Germany, to care for the German cemeteries, and they would have volunteer groups. And so in the German cemeteries in France, you would see grass sometimes up to your knees in certain sections, and other sections would be mowed perfectly because that's all they had time to mow, that group of volunteers that came over. But they made an agreement about 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, I can't remember, it's not that long ago. Of course, when you're getting old, everything seems like yesterday, right? They made an agreement, I think it was for the 65th anniversary, that French could be hired to do the mowing and care of the German cemeteries. And so those cemeteries are now cared for like the Commonwealth cemeteries and the French cemeteries. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
How much intelligence did they have on each side about what the other was doing?
Well, quite a bit, actually. Most of it was wrong, but one of the biggest oxymorons is military intelligence, right? There was quite a bit of intelligence that was going on. Of course, there were famous spies like Mata Hari and people like that who was working for the Germans, was found out and executed. The Turks, by the way, come in on the side of the Central Powers, meaning Austria and Germany, toward the war. Of course, there's a famous battle at Gallipoli with the Australians that are there. And but there is quite a bit of spying going on. How much good did it do? Not very much, mainly, and because the lines are so stagnated, there really, intelligence didn't play a great part, even though there were tremendous attempts, to find out what was going on. Tanks are called tanks. That was a big intelligence thing, by the way. The reason those armored vehicles are called tanks is because the English thought that's a good code word. We're making tanks. They look like water tanks, right? And so it was a code word. That's why we call them tanks today. Only because that's what the English started calling them. Okay? But I mean, as far as intelligence, it really was inconsequential in the First World War. It wasn't mean it didn't happen. They weren't trying.
Unintelligent.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
What were the German casualties?
The German casualties. Let me get my little cheat sheet here. They were tremendous. Also, Germany lost more soldiers killed than France. 1,773,000 killed, with a 4,126,000 wounded, for a total of 7,142,000 compared to the French 6 million. But remember, the German population was greater. So a percentage of the French had the highest percentage of deaths and wounded in the First World War. But the Germans lost more total. Good question.
And there probably were very few German civilian casualties, right? Because it was fought on French soil.
As far as accuracy, you mean?
Civilians.
Oh, civilian casualties, no. There were an incredible amount of civilian casualties during that time, but not as many as you might think. And the reason is because the front was so stagnated, many of the French people moved away from there and so weren't caught. It wasn't in a war of movement, so they weren't caught in as casualties during the war.
But my comment went to the German civilians.
Oh, German civilians?
I thought that because it was fought on French soil, I wouldn't.
Oh, there weren't very many German civilians. Now, I'll leave you with this last thought, though. One of the most horrific things of the First World War was that at the end of the First World War, in the last months of the First World War, there was an incredible flu epidemic. Okay? And I told you about the millions of casualties in the First World War. It dwarfed by 1/3 those that died of the flu, influenza. And that flu was brought back to the United States of America by guess who? The soldiers. It was brought back. And so if some of you had relatives that died of the flu, my father had the flu. He was born in 1914. He got the flu. He survived, obviously. He was 4 years old. But he said he still remembers, one of his first memories was he would wake up, he was 4 years old, he would hear this church bell ringing, and he thought he was in heaven, okay? And he had recovered from the flu. He'd been out for several days, unconscious from the flu, and survived, but many did not. The greatest flu epidemic the world has ever seen, when we talk about Ebola and everything else, occurred right after the First World War. And the casualties in the First World War were 1/3 of what the casualties were of the great flu epidemic of 1918. 1/3. And very little known. Okay, thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. We're just at 8:30, so finish up on time.